Hello and welcome to the Biological Anthropology lecture series. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. Here we explore what it means to be human, biologically, evolutionarily, and behaviorally. Let's begin our journey into the science of humanity. Welcome to Module 7, The First Hominins. In this module, we investigate how the earliest members of our lineage emerged and what made them distinct. In this section, we explore competing hypotheses about why bipedalism evolved, from provisioning to environmental shifts. Let's revisit the intellectual world in which Darwin was writing. In the late 19th century, almost no fossils of early hominins had been discovered, and the timeline of human evolution was still a mystery. So Darwin worked with what he knew. Humans walk upright, humans make tools, and humans have much larger brains than other primates. From that vantage point, it made sense to imagine these traits emerging together as part of a single evolutionary package. Let's look at how Darwin framed it. He suggested that bipedalism evolved to free the hands for making and using tools, especially in hunting. In his view, once early humans began hunting more effectively, using stones, sticks, or other implements, selection would favor individuals with hands unburdened by locomotion. That same shift, he argued, would place pressure on the brain to grow larger, allowing more complex tool-making and more strategic hunting behavior. It was a tidy narrative, upright walking to tool use to larger brains to reduced canines as hunting replaced male-male combat. You might wonder why this hypothesis persisted for so long, partly because it fit well with cultural ideas of the time. Humans were seen as tool makers first and foremost, with hunting framed as a central driver of our superiority over other animals, and until the mid-20th century, there wasn't much fossil evidence to contradict the sequence. As more discoveries accumulated, Australopithecus skeletons with clear adaptations for bipedalism, but small brains, or stone tools appearing much later than expected, the timeline fell out of sync with Darwin's model. The fossils showed that upright walking emerged millions of years before consistent tool use and long before the dramatic expansion of brain size. This doesn't make Darwin wrong in a simplistic sense. It highlights how science evolves as new evidence appears. So today, Darwin's hunting hypothesis is viewed more as an early, historically important attempt to explain bipedalism rather than a complete account. But understanding it helps us appreciate how interpretations shift with each new fossil discovery, and how every hypothesis, even those later revised, contributes to the broader conversation about what shaped the earliest members of our lineage. Let's revisit the landscape in which early hominins lived. For a long time, many researchers imagined our ancestors evolving on wide, open savannas. But evidence from fossil sites and ancient soils paints a more complex picture, one where forests were not disappearing entirely, but breaking up into smaller scattered patches. This is the ecological backdrop that shaped the patchy forest hypothesis proposed by Rodman and McHenry. Let's look at the basic idea. If you imagine an environment where resources like fruits, leaves, or shelter trees are no longer continuous, but instead clustered in separated pockets, moving efficiently between those patches becomes crucial. Quadrupedal primates, especially those adapted to life in dense forests, face a challenge here. Their locomotion is highly effective in trees, but less so when forced to travel longer distances on the ground. In this context, Rodman and McHenry argued that bipedal walking could actually become more energy efficient than quadrupedalism. In other words, standing upright wasn't just a novelty, it was a practical solution to a changing habitat. The hypothesis doesn't claim that hominins were abandoning the forest altogether. Instead, it suggests they were navigating a mosaic, a mix of woodland pockets and open stretches. Bipedalism offered a way to conserve energy while crossing exposed areas and still allowed access to trees for food or safety. Think about the advantage of having your hands free during these movements. Carrying gathered foods, Infants or tools becomes easier when locomotion no longer depends on all four limbs. You might wonder how this differs from earlier ideas like Darwin's. The key distinction is that Rodman and McHenry weren't focusing on tool use or hunting. They were looking at locomotion itself, how to move most efficiently through an environment that no longer supported the older, strictly arboreal lifestyle. Their approach is grounded in biomechanics and ecology rather than behavior or cultural traits. Another strength of the patchy forest hypothesis is that it aligns with what we know about climatic fluctuations during the late Miocene and early Pliocene. Global patterns were shifting. Temperatures cooled slightly, moisture levels changed, and forests thinned in many regions where early hominins later appear. This broader environmental context helps explain why a primate might gain an advantage by experimenting with upright walking long before the appearance of tools or large brains. So, when we examine the earliest hominin fossils, species showing a mix of climbing abilities and bipedal traits, the patchy forest hypothesis gives us a compelling framework. It helps us see bipedalism not as a sudden leap, but as an adaptive response to a world becoming more fragmented, where energy-efficient travel between shrinking forest patches could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Let's revisit the question at the heart of all these hypotheses. What pressures favored habitual bipedalism long before large brains or stone tools appeared? Lovejoy's provisioning hypothesis offers a very different angle from the environmentally driven models. Instead of looking outward to habitat change, it looks inward to social behavior, reproductive strategies, and the daily logistics of raising offspring. Let's look at the core idea. Lovejoy proposed that early hominins may have benefited from more stable pair bonds and increased parental investment, especially from males. In this model, bipedalism becomes advantageous not because it helps individuals escape predators or move across landscapes more efficiently, but because it frees the hands for carrying resources. You might wonder, carrying what exactly? Primarily food. Lovejoy argued that a male who could gather food and transport it back to a mate and offspring would improve their survival chances. In turn, this behavior could lead to more frequent and predictable reproductive opportunities for the provisioning male. The hypothesis links locomotion directly to social structure. If individuals begin provisioning one another, especially in pair-bonded relationships, the competitive pressures that maintain large, weaponized canines in many primates may lessen. And indeed, early hominins show reduced canine size and the loss of the honing complex. Lovejoy interpreted this as evidence that social aggression was muted, and cooperation, or at least reduced male-male conflict, was becoming more central. Let's think about what this implies for daily life. A bipedal primate with its hands free could carry multiple food items over longer distances, something quadrupeds have a much harder time doing. The offspring themselves, helpless for longer periods than in many other primates, could also be carried more easily. The provisioning hypothesis suggests that these behaviors became part of a successful reproductive strategy, reinforcing anatomical changes toward upright walking. You might wonder whether this model fits the fossil record. Lovejoy linked his ideas partly to the anatomy of Ardipithecus ramidus, which shows reduced canine dimorphism and hints of changing social dynamics. While not all researchers agree with his interpretations, the hypothesis plays a valuable role by reminding us that evolution isn't driven solely by environmental forces. Social behavior, mating systems, and parental strategies can be just as powerful in shaping anatomy. So, as we consider this hypothesis alongside others, keep in mind that each offers a different lens. Lovejoy's contribution is to highlight the social world of early hominins, and to propose that our commitment to bipedalism may have started not just in the landscape, but in the relationships and responsibilities that held early families together. Now let's revisit what all these hypotheses are trying to explain. Bipedalism didn't appear in a vacuum. It emerged because it offered certain advantages, but every advantage in evolution comes with a cost. That balance of benefits and drawbacks is what we mean by evolutionary trade-offs. Let's look at the benefits first, whether through provisioning, navigating patchy forests, or some combination of factors. Walking upright freed the hands, improved long-distance travel, and opened new possibilities for gathering and carrying resources. These advantages clearly helped early hominins survive in shifting landscapes. But bipedalism also brought significant disadvantages. An upright posture exposes vital organs to predators and requires complex balancing that quadrupeds don't face. Our lower backs bear the stress of supporting the upper body, making us susceptible to pain and injury. The reorganization of the pelvis necessary for efficient walking also narrowed the birth canal, even as brains eventually began to grow larger, creating a long-standing obstetric challenge unique to our lineage. You might wonder what this tells us about early hominins. It reminds us that evolution isn't about perfection. It's about trade-offs that work well enough in a given environment. Bipedalism wasn't a flawless solution, but it was a workable one, and it shaped everything that followed in the human story. Early hominins lived in complex, changing ecosystems, and their anatomy likely reflects a combination of ecological pressures and behavioral opportunities. What matters is that bipedalism appears early, before big brains and before reliable stone tools, suggesting that locomotion was one of the first major commitments of the hominin lineage. As we move into the next section, keep these evolutionary debates in mind. They shape how we interpret the earliest fossils and help us understand what motivated our ancestors to take those first steps into a new way of life. Thank you for joining this lecture. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. I hope this session deepened your understanding of biological anthropology. Keep exploring what it means to be human. See you soon.